I was observing a study hall earlier this week and found myself watching this one student. Let's call him Ben. If you looked at his desk, you'd see the picture of academic potential. Color-coded notes, a high-end laptop, and a feedback sheet from a private tutor. For about 10 minutes, he was in the zone, genuinely focused, writing an essay with a level of intensity that suggested he actually cared about the result. He looked capable, even ambitious. But then the atmosphere shifted instantly. Two of his friends walked in and slumped into the chairs at his table. They weren't necessarily bad kids, but they carried a heavy energy of indifference, laughing about bombing a quiz and making loud jokes about how tryhards are boring. What happened next was almost painful to watch. Ben didn't just say hello, he physically shrank. He quickly snapped his laptop shut, shoved his organized notes under a binder, and his entire demeanor changed. Within seconds, he went from a focused student to mimicking their apathy, laughing along when they mocked the assignment he was just working on. He literally hid his intelligence to match the lowest common denominator of the table. That split-second switch from ambition to calculated mediocrity wasn't about a lack of discipline or a gap in the curriculum. It was a survival strategy. It made me realize that all the expensive tutors and upgraded classrooms in the world don't stand a chance against the silent, crushing weight of who a student chooses to sit next to. That story, that moment of calculated mediocrity, is exactly what we're deep diving into today. Our mission is to unpack the mechanisms behind that immediate, sort of self-sacrificing survival strategy. We're looking at a whole stack of research that explains how peer influence operates, and specifically what happens when it shifts from, positive support to that crushing negative weight. And crucially, we're asking how this effect is measured, not just in academic settings, but in personal growth, social development, and even how our digital tools are changing these dynamics.
It's such a compelling starting point because that moment you describe, Ben physically recoiling from his own work, it just cuts right to the core conflict of social psychology and education. We invest fortunes in optimizing everything else, resources, curriculum, technology, but often the most volatile, the most powerful, and frankly, the least controlled variable is the social environment right around the student. We really need to understand the science behind why fitting in so often feels more important than standing out or succeeding.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start with foundational psychology. Before we get into all the numbers and the data, what is the fundamental role of peer relations? How do researchers even define this duality of influence?
Well, the fundamental role is defined exactly by that duality you mentioned. Especially during adolescence and, early adulthood, peers are absolutely essential. On one side, good peer relations are proven to significantly boost a student's academic outcomes and their overall personal development. They provide the social, the emotional support that you need to navigate these really high-stress environments.
So they're the support group.
They're the support group. But then you flip that coin, and negative peer influences actively demote students. They contribute to decreased academic performance, massive demotivation, and a measurable increase in stress and anxiety. The environment where Ben felt he had to hide his work is a perfect illustration of that demotivational side just completely dominating the conversation.
So it's not just about, a minor distraction or wasting a few minutes chatting. It fundamentally hits their internal motivation and their mental well-being.
Mm-hmm.
What are the key theories that help us understand why this shift, this conformity, happens so incredibly quickly?
The most direct explanation for that hiding the laptop behavior comes from social learning theory. This was pioneered by Albert Bandura back in the 70s. The theory basically posits that people acquire knowledge, skills, behaviors, primarily through observation, imitation, and modeling. So if you are a student and you're surrounded by peers who are actively engaged, who are studying late, discussing complex ideas, you are naturally just more likely to observe and then model those high-achieving behaviors.
So modeling isn't just simple mimicry, it's an internalization. If the group values showing up to the study session, you internalize that behavior as the accepted norm, the thing that gets rewarded.
Precisely. And the key mechanism driving that internalization is social reinforcement. It's peer approval. If your friends applaud academic effort, your motivation and your performance improve because you're being rewarded socially for it. But conversely, if your friends mock it, if they laugh at tryhards, like in your opening story, the motivation to perform it shifts entirely. The student's primary motivation becomes conforming to the group norm. It's seeking approval by showing apathy. The social consequence completely overpowers the academic goal.
Okay, that explains the behavioral part, the imitation. But for the Ben story to really make sense, we need to get at that deep core psychological drive that makes social approval trump ambition. Is there a framework that addresses those internal needs?
There is, and that brings us to self-determination theory, or SDT. It's a vital complement to social learning. SDT argues that our intrinsic human motivation, our inner drive, it hinges on satisfying three basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Okay, so autonomy is the feeling of control over your own actions. Competence is feeling capable, effective, and relatedness that's the connection, right? The belonging to others.
Yeah.
In the Ben scenario, which of those needs is being threatened?
Relatedness is immediately and directly threatened. Ben's connection to his peers is contingent on him abandoning his academic competence and, you could argue, his autonomy too, the freedom to choose to be ambitious. See, nurturing peer relationships satisfy relatedness, which is incredibly powerful. And when peers offer, say, useful study tips or positive feedback, they also increase a student's feeling of competence, which naturally encourages them toward academic goals. It boosts that intrinsic motivation.
But what happens when those needs clash? I mean, Ben clearly needed relatedness, but to get it, he had to undermine his competence. He had to literally hide the notes that proved he was capable.
And that is the conflict point. If the social context supports all three needs, motivation just flourishes. But the moment the peer context undermines competence, by criticizing high performance or forces conformity, destroying autonomy, all just to achieve relatedness, the internal motivational system suffers a massive hit. The need for belonging is so fundamental, particularly in adolescence, that students will often sacrifice their sense of competence and their autonomy just to secure that relatedness. They're trading long-term growth for immediate social security.
That makes relatedness either an incredible booster rocket or a paralyzing deadweight. It depends completely on what the peer group values.
It's the delivery vehicle. If the group's values are positive, it delivers competence and connection. That leads to intrinsic motivation. If the group's values are anti-achievement, it delivers conformity and apathy, leading to an extrinsic motivation driven by a fear of social exclusion.
And finally, to complete this whole theoretical framework, we have to recognize these interactions aren't happening in a vacuum. They're part of a larger system, which I think brings us to ecological systems theory.
Correct. This theory, it's often associated with Bronfenbrenner, gives us the holistic view. It emphasizes that student development isn't happening in isolation. It's influenced by multiple sort of nested levels of interaction. You have the immediate peer group, which is the microsystem, the school culture, the mesosystem, and then broader societal norms, the macrosystem. The theory highlights that peer interactions and academic outcomes are linked through these really complex feedback loops. So, for example, if the school system prioritizes, say, cutthroat competition, it might actually exacerbate the negative pressure that's felt within that immediate peer group.
So if we put it all together, social learning tells us how Ben learned to hide his work, SDT explains why he prioritized fitting in over studying, and ecological systems theory reminds us that the entire school and cultural context influenced how severe that pressure felt. That overarching view feels necessary for designing any kind of effective intervention, because fixing one part might just be undone by the feedback loop from another.
Absolutely. If we only focus on boosting an individual's competence without addressing the social environment that punishes it, we are, quite simply, setting students up for inevitable failure, or, as we saw, calculated mediocrity.
Okay, that theoretical grounding is incredibly helpful for understanding the emotional and psychological side of things. Now let's look at the hard data, because this is where that phrase, calculated mediocrity, really starts to get quantified. We have some specific research findings from a university context, and it focused on students in India, a region chosen partly because it has these highly competitive educational environments where maybe these non-positive peer interactions are often overlooked or just dismissed as part of the stress.
And that's a critical choice of context. These competitive environments, particularly those with intense parental or institutional expectations, they tend to externalize achievement pressure. This often means that when students rebel against that pressure, they do it through their immediate peer group, which makes that negative influence particularly potent and measurable.
Let's break down the methodology. This was a quantitative correlational study. It involved 155 participants, all university students aged 18 to 25. They were looking to establish statistical relationships between three variables: peer influence, academic motivation, so both intrinsic and extrinsic drive, and personal growth, which they defined as the internal drive for self-worth, autonomy, and holistic development.
And they used established psychological instruments for rigor, which is important. The peer pressure questionnaire revised, the academic motivation scale, and the personal growth initiative scale. This makes sure they weren't just measuring subjective feelings, but established psychological constructs. The whole goal was to statistically establish the relationship, looking specifically for those detrimental negative correlations that we've been hypothesizing about.
Okay, let's get into the core findings. What did the data reveal about the link between peer pressure and that first goal, academic motivation?
The analysis confirmed a direct negative correlation between peer pressure and academic motivation. The specific calculation gave them a Pearson's R value of negative 0.185.
Okay, so let's explain that. A negative correlation means the two variables move in opposite directions. But what does a magnitude of R equals minus 0.185 actually mean in practice? Is that a massive effect?
It's generally considered a weak to moderate correlation, but crucially, it is statistically significant, with a p-value of 0.021. This means there's only a 2.1% chance that this relationship happened randomly, so it confirms that it is a genuine inhibitor. In practical terms, it means that as the peer group imposes higher social pressure to conform, say, to prioritize socializing over studying, the student's internal drive to pursue academic success measurably decreases. It's the statistical proof of that demotivation effect we've been talking about.
So the pressure from the peer group is actively working against the student's desire to focus on their work. That confirms half the hypothesis. But I have to say, the next correlation, the one involving personal growth, I found that one far more striking.
You're referring to the relationship between peer pressure and personal growth. And you're right, here the correlation was a stronger inverse relationship with a Pearson's error value of negative 0.301.
Wait, so that's roughly 60% stronger than the correlation with academic motivation. That suggests that negative peer dynamics are a significantly greater threat to a student's core identity and development than they are to their immediate GPA.
Exactly. This is the massive insight from this study. Peer pressure doesn't just make you study less, it fundamentally compromises your identity and your sense of self-worth. If we connect this back to SDT, the pressure to conform forces students to compromise their autonomy, their control over their own ambition and their competence by hiding their capabilities. The statistical result, R equals negative 0.301, with a p-value of less than 0.001, confirms that negative peer dynamics are a profound inhibitor of internal personal development. They're chipping away at self-worth and the proactive drive for growth.
This finding is the quantitative proof of Ben's experience. He didn't just procrastinate, he performed an act of self-censorship. Why do you think identity gets compromised faster than grades?
Well, because the reward system is immediate. When Ben closed his laptop, he instantly received approval. He avoided a social penalty. The compromise to his grades or his future growth, that's all delayed. Adolescents are wired to prioritize immediate social security, that relatedness over future competence. The negative feedback loop from peers, the laughter at tryhards, it's an emotional attack on their sense of self-worth and autonomy. It makes the pressure to change who they are far more intense than the pressure to change what they do. That calculated mediocrity is a self-sabotaging coping mechanism that allows them to survive socially.
It's survival over success. Wow. Now, despite those strong inverse correlations, there was a positive link found between the two motivational outcomes, right? The ideal scenario.
Yes, academic motivation was positively correlated with personal growth, and it clocked in at R equals 0.379. This is the strongest positive correlation they found, which confirms the expected synergistic relationship. Basically, students who are internally driven to succeed academically are also at the same time more driven towards self-worth, autonomy, and proactive development in their personal lives.
So the goal for educators, for parents, isn't just to boost one, it's to protect that positive feedback loop. And what this research shows is that negative peer influence acts as a strong external force designed specifically to interrupt it.
Precisely. It actively disrupts that natural, positive cycle of growth and ambition.
The study also looked into gender differences. What did the descriptive statistics initially suggest about how males and females experience peer pressure in this competitive university setting?
Descriptively, they did observe some slight variation. Female participants reported slightly higher mean scores in peer pressure. It was 60.3 compared to 57.0 for males. And they also had marginally higher academic motivation, 121 versus 119 for males. So the initial data hinted that female students might perceive slightly more social pressure, perhaps because of different social expectations in that culture, but they also showed a slight edge in motivation.
But the real test is whether that difference in experience translates into a difference in impact. When they ran the rigorous independent samples t-test to check for significant differences, what did they find?
They found that, statistically, there was no significant gender difference in how peer pressure impacts academic motivation and personal growth. The p-values were well above the 0.05 threshold. This is crucial. While the reported mean levels of pressure differed slightly, the effect size of that pressure on inhibiting motivation and growth was statistically similar for both male and female students.
The conclusion, then, is that the vulnerability to this negative peer influence is a universal human thing in this developmental stage, even if the cultural expression of that pressure might vary a little.
Correct. The hypotheses that suggested significant gender differences were rejected. The vulnerability to having your autonomy and your competence undermined by a hostile social environment. It affects male and female students in a very similar way when it comes to inhibiting their core drive and their personal development.
So if you were advising a university based on this data, what's the primary policy implication here, especially from finding such a strong negative link to personal growth?
The primary takeaway has to be a shift in institutional focus, away from pure individualistic competition. The researchers concluded that these findings should inform university policies aimed at fostering genuinely collaborative and inclusive educational experiences. That environment, the one that's often characterized by high-stakes testing and intense isolated effort, especially in contexts like India, it needs to actively invest in positive peer support systems. This data provides the statistical urgency to design targeted intervention programs to boost not just academic motivation, but that internal personal growth by actively leveraging positive peer dynamics.
Okay, we've established the psychological cost and we've quantified the individual impact. Now let's zoom out to a macro level, shifting from individual motivation to the structural analysis of peer effects through the lens of econometrics and large-scale public policy. This is where we start to see how the composition of an entire classroom or a school cohort can affect outcomes.
And this is a really complex area because we're no longer just looking at 3 friends at a table. We're looking at hundreds of students being assigned to groups. Econometrically, isolating the influence of peers is notoriously difficult, primarily because of what's called the reflection problem. We have to define exactly what kind of peer effect we're trying to measure.
Okay, break down the reflection problem for us. If I'm looking at how one student's outcome affects another, what are the 2 distinct effects I have to untangle?
Okay, so we define it using 2 main factors. First, you have the endogenous cure effect. We can call it beta 1. This is when my outcome, let's say my math score, depends directly on my peers' outcomes. So if the average test score of my close friends goes up, mine is likely to follow just by being in that elevated environment.
So it's the peer performance itself that's driving my performance.
Exactly. The second factor is the contextual peer effect, or beta 2. This is where my outcome depends not on what my peers achieve, but on their fixed characteristics. So for example, my test score might depend on the average socioeconomic status, or the average prior education level, or the average parental support of my peer group.
Ah, I see the problem. If my peer group is made up of students from high socioeconomic backgrounds, that's a characteristic. Beta 2, they are also very likely to have high test scores. That's an outcome, beta 1. How can a researcher possibly separate the influence of their parents' wealth from the influence of their own high scores?
And that is the core identification challenge. That is the reflection problem. Mathematically, these 2 effects often can't be separately identified in standard analysis because they're so highly correlated. However, the workaround, and this is the crucial point, is that proving their combined existence confirms that social interactions and group composition play a vital, measurable role in determining individual outcomes. If the combined effect is non-zero, we know we have powerful social spillovers.
So to get around this challenge, researchers have to get creative. They can't, ethically or practically randomize students into classrooms just to study them. So they rely on events that non-randomly shake up the composition of peer groups. What are some of these real-world quasi-experiments?
Quasi-experiments rely on natural shocks or policy changes that effectively create a sort of a random assignment of peers. Notable examples used in this field include analyzing student reallocation after large-scale natural disasters, like Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, which forced students into entirely new, randomly assigned peer groups in different districts. Researchers also analyze data from desegregation programs, or they exploit the strict administrative admission cutoffs at oversubscribed schools or colleges.
How does an administrative cutoff create a random assignment? That sounds like a neat trick.
It is. Imagine a highly desirable public school admits students based solely on an entrance exam score of, say, 750 or higher. A student who scores 751 gets in, and one who scores 749 is rejected and placed in a different, less selective school. Researchers can compare the long-term outcomes of students just above that cutoff to those just below it. The two groups are virtually identical in terms of ability, but the cutoff randomly sorts them into vastly different peer environments. It provides a really clean way to isolate the impact of the peer composition, the beta 2 characteristics they're exposed to.
That is clever.
Yeah.
So using that kind of data, what are the most consistent findings we see when it comes to peer effects and academic achievement?
One of the most consistent and important findings is what's called the achiever effect. Studies across various settings generally conclude that having a higher achieving peer is better for a student's own achievement. It means a rising tide really does lift all boats. Placing a lower achieving student in a group of high achievers tends to benefit them academically. Conversely, having disruptive peers, particularly aggressive males, consistently and negatively affects college enrollment, completion rates, and even earnings later in life.
So the lesson is, choose your study partners wisely. But it's not just about raw achievement. The gender balance of the classroom seems to matter significantly through what you call the class composition effect.
Yes, and this is a fascinating finding. Studies show that having a larger share of females in the classroom improves math performance for all students, both girls and boys.
Wait, math performance improves for the boys as well. Why is that?
The gain is generally attributed not to, some kind of cognitive transfer, but to a resulting better learning environment. Classrooms with a higher female ratio tend to exhibit lower levels of classroom disruption and violence, and they often facilitate improved student-teacher relationships. A more orderly, less conflict-ridden environment simply allows the curriculum to be delivered more effectively, and that benefits everyone, regardless of gender.
That structural factor, a calmer classroom, trumps individual disruption. What about that contextual characteristic we discussed, socioeconomic status? Does the wealth of your peers matter beyond just their test scores?
Oh, absolutely. The socioeconomic connection reveals that the characteristics of peers have a long-lasting effect. Research indicates that peers' household earnings increase the years of education completed by male students and their likelihood of working full-time as adults. This is a profound external effect. Interestingly, researchers note that this socioeconomic context matters very little for the student's raw measured IQ score. The benefit is seen in persistence, network development, career trajectory, and educational attainment.
So the environment shapes opportunity and persistence, not core intelligence. This brings us right back to Ben and this idea of calculated mediocrity, where peers actively enforce social rules that penalize effort.
This is often studied under the concept of social norm enforcement. And research using randomized control trials, or RCTs, shows that peers actively reinforce social norms that can undermine academic effort. In one set of experiments, in settings where academic effort is highly penalized socially, where try hard is a serious insult-making participation in a beneficial activity, like an SAT prep course, publicly observable significantly reduces the sign-up rates. Students deliberately avoid appearing ambitious to maintain their social standing.
They are trading tangible, future academic gain for immediate, intangible social approval. That's a direct demonstration of the relatedness need winning out over competence and autonomy.
Precisely. And the pressure works the other way, too. In settings that highly value academic ability, making performance observable reduces the take-up rate among low-ability individuals. This suggests peer pressure influences choices to avoid being seen as struggling, which is also a defense mechanism. In either case, avoiding the try-hard label or avoiding the incompetent label, peer pressure fundamentally influences critical educational decisions.
These macro findings must have massive implications for global policy. Let's look at how large-scale international rankings, like PISA, factor into this whole conversation.
Right. PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, it evaluates 15-year-olds globally in math, science, and reading. It provides comparable data for countries to improve their education policies. But its influence is often less about technical improvement and more about political leveraging. PISA has what you could call a profound normative effect. Policymakers see these rankings as a critical barometer, and they use the reports to define national problems and set the policy agenda, which can lead to rapid, sometimes drastic changes.
Can you give us the specifics on the famous PISA shock in Germany? What were the previously accepted policies that were challenged, and what kind of structural changes did they actually implement?
Sure. Before the first PISA results, Germany's federalized system meant that educational policy was largely controlled by the individual states, the Länder. This led to highly variable standards and a kind of cultural belief in the superiority of their tiered system. The PISA results, which were surprisingly poor for a country with Germany's economic strength, just shattered that confidence. The shock led to an unprecedented political consensus. They introduced common national standards, standardized central exams, and created an institutionalized structure to enforce compliance and monitor outcomes across the different states.
That is a fundamental structural change driven by external comparison. But you also noted the influence varies, citing Hungary, which saw very little change despite similar results.
Yes, and this highlights that data alone isn't enough. National political will and the cultural context are equally critical. If the policy environment is already fragmented or resistant to external pressure, the PISA results just become a footnote, not a catalyst for change.
I also read that policy actors often use PISA data very selectively. It sounds like they use the ranking as a political tool to justify reforms they already wanted to implement, rather than following the data's actual recommendations.
That is precisely the case, and it's a vital observation. Policy actors frequently refer to high-performing PISA countries, say Finland or Singapore too, and I'm quoting here, legitimize and justify their intended reform agenda within their own contested national debates. They often focus only on superficial features like the country rankings and ignore the detailed contextual analysis provided in the reports. Take Portugal, for example. Policy actors there use PISA data to push for new, stringent teacher assessment reforms and to promote discourse about pupils repeating a year. The problem is that PISA's correlational data did not directly establish a causal link to support those specific reforms. The rankings served as a political weapon to set the terms of the education debate, even if the data didn't strictly mandate that orientation.
So PISA isn't a neutral roadmap. It's a political instrument, and its impact on the educational system is mediated by national politics. That's a critical nuance for anyone looking at global education reform. We've established the psychological and the macrostructural influence of peers. Now let's consider how technology mediates, and sometimes complicates, all of this. We're moving beyond the physical study hall into what's called technology-enhanced learning, or TETL.
TETL tools have just fundamentally transformed collaborative learning. The classic limitations of time and space that you had to physically meet for group work are dissolved. We're talking about using learning management systems like Canvas, shared digital spaces like Google Workspace or Microsoft Teams, and dedicated discussion forums.
When peer interaction shifts to a digital space, do the underlying psychological theories we discussed, like social learning and SDT, do they still hold up?
Or does the technology create entirely new dynamics? The theory is powerfully reinforced, but in new ways. Social constructivism, for instance, which argues that knowledge is co-constructed through dialogue, is fully supported by TETL. Discussion forums, for example, allow asynchronous knowledge co-construction. This means students can engage in thoughtful dialogue and debate without the pressure of an immediate verbal response, which often favors the more extroverted students in a physical classroom. And we also look at connectivism, which focuses on learning as navigating information across digital platforms. LMS tools facilitate this by creating complex, interconnected environments where instructors and students manage, share, and connect resources. The digital sphere is just the new source of relatedness and competence development.
Sounds like technology is a net positive for collaboration because it opens up the playing field. What are the key benefits of this digital peer interaction?
Beyond the flexibility, there are crucial benefits. First, improved engagement. TEL tools offer multiple channels for interaction. For the quieter student, maybe even a Ben figure who would be too intimidated to raise his hand in class, an asynchronous discussion board allows them to formulate a sophisticated response and participate equally. This encourages more active and inclusive collaboration. Second is skill development. Collaborative tools enhance peer-to-peer interaction, supporting the development of critical soft skills like teamwork, digital communication, and complex problem-solving. Tools like collaborative concept mapping, where a group jointly builds a knowledge map online, have been shown to directly improve students' critical thinking abilities by forcing them to negotiate the relationships between complex ideas.
And that flexibility factor you mentioned must be a massive aid for inclusivity.
It provides essential flexibility and inclusivity. Asynchronous tools accommodate diverse learning paces and allow remote participation, which effectively removes geographical constraints. For working students, or those balancing family commitments, the ability to contribute to a shared document at 10 p.m. is vital for securing relatedness without sacrificing their other responsibilities.
However, technology is only a tool. It doesn't solve structural problems, and it often introduces new ones. Where do the challenges of TEPLI lie?
Oh, the challenges are significant, starting with access and equity. Technology can create new barriers if it's not managed properly. We see significant disparities in access to necessary technology, reliable internet infrastructure, and varying levels of digital literacy. Researchers highlight this issue particularly in developing contexts, like Nigerian higher education institutions, where inadequate funding means infrastructure challenges persist, making successful, equitable implementation really difficult.
So if the institution doesn't invest in robust infrastructure or training, the tools themselves just create a new divide, favoring students who can afford high-end laptops and fast internet.
Exactly. And even when access is solved, you hit the pedagogical overload problem. Instructors are often highly skilled in traditional methods, but they struggle to adapt them to digital platforms. This results in poorly structured online activities that fail to promote meaningful interaction. An instructor might just post a question and expect a vibrant discussion, but without careful design, clear rules of engagement, feedback mechanisms, defined roles, the activity often devolves into confusion, disengagement, or just superficial effort.
So it's not enough to provide Google Docs. You have to teach students how to collaborate in Google Docs and teach instructors how to grade that collaboration.
Correct. The instructors need specialized skills to balance content teaching with facilitating dynamic group dynamics in a digital space.
And finally, the technology doesn't magically solve the core human problem of uneven participation, the digital version of peer influence.
It doesn't. Technology does not solve fundamental peer issues. You still face challenges like social loafing, uneven participation, and the need for clear expectations and accountability. If Ben's friends join a shared digital assignment, they can still undermine the group by contributing minimal effort. We have to design accountability into the system, often by requiring explicit individual contributions or using software that tracks participation, because the negative dynamics simply transfer from the physical study hall to the online collaborative environment. Now, let's bring it back to the personal impact and the specific developmental stage where this influence is most acute. Senior secondary education. We need to look at the granular dimensions that really shape the decision-making of a student like Ben.
Senior secondary, so roughly age 15 and up. That's described as a critical juncture. Why is the adolescent mind at this stage particularly vulnerable to this silent weight of peer influence?
Well, adolescence is the period when identity formation, separation from primary caregivers just accelerate rapidly. Students are making critical decisions about their future career paths and educational attainment, which means their peer group becomes the most significant factor in shaping their emerging identity and behavior. They're highly susceptible because that need for relatedness and social acceptance often overrides the still developing long-term planning areas of the brain. The stakes are incredibly high for academic performance, mental health, and overall well-being.
To measure this complex web of influence, researchers developed the peer influence scale, which breaks down influence into 5 core actionable dimensions. Let's walk through what they actually measure.
Okay, the peer influence scale is designed to assess the breadth of peer impact. First, the academic dimension. This is the obvious one. How peers influence study habits, like staying up late to study, participating in group study, or conversely, encouraging skipping class. Second is family and personal influence. This measures the shift in loyalty. It involves behaviors like ignoring parents in favor of friends or making annoyed gestures when parents refuse requests. This dimension quantifies how the student prioritizes the social group over their family's expectations.
Right.
Third is the social dimension. This covers the desire for connection and visibility, so liking to make friends on digital platforms like Facebook or simply enjoying time spent in the company of peers. It measures that need for social integration.
Okay.
Fourth is recreation. This is the conformity of leisure and style. Copying friends' fashion, being convinced to go to the cinema, or participating in shared recreational activities, even if they conflict with other responsibilities.
That's the relatable dimension. I think we've all bought a shirt or listened to a band we secretly hated just because our friend group validated it. The data proves our poor fashion choices were scientifically driven by the need for relatedness.
It's the low-stakes conformity that establishes group membership. But the final dimension is where the influence becomes destructive, the habits dimension. This relates directly to high-risk behaviors and antisocial activities.
Let's focus on that habits dimension, because this is where peer influence moves from benign conformity to genuine harm. What are the specific examples researchers use to gauge this destructive influence?
The scale items are very explicit, and they're designed to capture high risk and antisocial compliance. They include things like participating in antisocial activities, believing in taking intoxicants in the company of peers, missing classes because friends do, and, critically, doing something known to be wrong just to stay with friends.
That last one, doing something known to be wrong just to stay with friends. That's the ultimate survival strategy we started with, but it's applied to far higher stakes than just academics. It means the price of relatedness can be the sacrifice of your moral code or your safety.
Exactly. Other high-risk examples include breaking traffic rules or driving after drinking when with friends. This demonstrates that the pressure is often active compliance coercion or a strong social expectation to secure belonging, not just passive modeling. The development of these scales is so vital because they quantify the specific, dangerous types of risks that adolescents face due to these peer dynamics.
And this all seems to hinge on which goal the student prioritizes. When Ben shut his laptop, he was prioritizing a social goal over an academic one. How does the research specifically categorize these competing achievement goals?
The research refers to these as social achievement goals. They identify two key orientations. The maladaptive orientation is the social demonstration avoid goal. This is when a student is driven primarily by trying to avoid looking incompetent or, as in the Ben example, avoiding the dreaded label of a tryhard. This goal orientation is consistently related to maladjustment, anxiety, and self-sabotage.
So it's a defensive posture. It's aimed at minimizing social damage.
Contrast that with the adaptive orientation, the social development goal. Here, the student focuses on improving their social competence, learning how to collaborate effectively, or improving communication skills within a group. This orientation is positively related to adjustment, better academic outcomes, and healthier personal development.
So the environment determines which goal dominates. If the peer group actively punishes ambition and rewards indifference, the social demonstration avoid goal takes over, resulting in that calculated mediocrity that we quantified with the correlation data.
Precisely. And in senior, secondary, and university settings, understanding which social achievement goal is dominant among a peer cohort is perhaps more predictive of a student's success than their prior academic records, because the social goals dictate whether they allowed themselves to pursue competence in the first place.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the initial observation that peer influence can lead students toward calculated mediocrity. It's supported across every piece of research we examined. From the individual psychological drive all the way up to the structural analysis of education policy, the social environment is the undeniable silent force shaping these trajectories.
Oh, it is strongly supported by the data. The quantitative study showed a statistically significant inverse correlation between peer pressure and academic motivation, and an even more severe impact on personal growth, with that raw value of negative 0.301. The pressure to conform actively inhibits a student's internal drive, and more profoundly, their sense of autonomy and self-worth.
And those peer environments, whether they're physical or digital, they're critical determinants. Positive environments satisfy the psychological needs for relatedness and competence, fostering intrinsic motivation, while negative ones encourage the enforcement of these detrimental social norms, like penalizing effort, or even promoting high-risk behaviors, as we saw with the peer influence scale.
We saw how difficult it is to isolate these effects in macro policy using econometrics, which necessitates these really complex methods like quasi-experiments, but they still confirm powerful structural outcomes like the achiever effect and the positive influence of class composition on learning environments.
Right, and even large-scale assessments like PISA, while providing valuable data, are frequently weaponized by national policy actors to justify political agendas rather than following a strict technical roadmap.
And even as technology offers tools for enhanced collaboration, it doesn't solve the core human problem of uneven effort and accountability, and it introduces new challenges related to access and instructor training. The social dynamics just migrate to a new platform.
Ultimately, all the factors we discussed, the psychological conflict, the quantitative data, policy dynamics, and specific developmental risks, they all converge on the truth that the social environment, especially who a student chooses to sit next to, remains the single most powerful yet often overlooked variable shaping educational success and personal trajectory. The research provides the empirical evidence needed for institutions to move past simply optimizing curriculum and start actively designing environments that foster positive peer dynamics and build real community.